Thank you very much, Maurice. I'm very glad to hear that you're all going to come to the exhibition. Right. Now, the purpose of my paper today is to look at the evidence that we have uncovered about the paintings attributed to Robert Peake in the National Portrait Gallery's collection in the course of the Making Art in Tudor Britain project. Although it's called Making Art in Tudor Britain, it does creep into Jacobean Britain as well. But this group of paintings associated with Peake are the first paintings from the 17th century to be looked at as part of this project. And what I was hoping to be able to do with these is to find out from the technical examination whether there were traits common to all these paintings, to paint other paintings associated with Peake, whether these could be seen, these traits, as markers for Peake's authorship or involvement, and also to examine what we could find out from the technical evidence about the organisation of Peake's workshop and his studio, and the division of labour within it, and about his response to different patrons or sitters as well. So hoping to uncover all kinds of things. Now, we always knew that it was going to be a rather tight time frame for getting our Peake paintings examined and through the studio by the time of this conference. And as it happens, that the three paintings are still in the studio. So a certain amount of investigation has been done, and I'm extremely grateful to my colleagues Sally Marriott, Polly Saltmarsh, Sophie Plender, and to Libby Sheldon of UCL for all the work that they've done on these pictures. It's not finished yet, though, so what I'm presenting today is very fresh, not to say raw, data, which still needs some digesting, and I think over time and with the accumulation of more information we should be able to get further. But I'm going to raise a lot of questions really at the end of this paper. I don't think it proposes any answers yet, but it does bring up, I think, some interesting things that have come out of the excellent work done so far on those paintings. Just to start by introducing Robert Peake, and I'm sorry for the quality of this slide. Peake was probably born about 1551. He came from Lincolnshire, and he trained in London as a goldsmith and became a freeman of the Goldsmiths Company in 1576. And this is, I think, another area that needs a bit more investigation, painters who started their careers as goldsmiths in England around this time. In fact, having become a freeman of the Goldsmiths Company, Peake almost immediately started working as a painter for Elizabeth I's Office of Revels. And there's more information about Peake in various sources, but actually Karen Hearn's done a very useful entry in the ODNB on Peake, which I think is the best sort of summary of material on his career. While a number of payments are recorded to Peake for portraits throughout his career, on the whole, these can't be linked to specific surviving paintings, but there are two touchstone works around which the rest of his oeuvre has been grouped on the basis of stylistic comparisons. This is the first work, an unknown military commander at Yale, dated 1593 and inscribed on the reverse by R.O. Rowe Peake. A number of portraits have been linked with this one on the basis of inscriptions, similarity with the inscription on the front, up here, which I think was the sort of beginning of a good exercise in comparing inscriptions on the front of paintings. But linking back with what we were talking about earlier, it turns out that some of these pictures which have been linked to this one by having very similar inscriptions, in fact, were painted after Peake's death. So that begs the question of who was painting the inscriptions on his portraits. The second sort of key portrait, securely linked with Peake, comes from the later period of his career, during the reign of James I, and it's this picture of Charles, Duke of York, later to become Charles I, of course, painted in 1613 to mark Charles's visit to Cambridge. This painting is documented. So it's documented clearly, and it acts as an excellent touchstone for Peake's work. It shows a number of characteristic traits that have been come to be seen as key elements of Peake's style, especially at this later period, the rather flattened modelling of the face, and I think this sort of marked shadow often comes into the modelling as well. Showy mimetic effects of the drapery, the distinctive metallic effect in the curtain, and this really is very, very characteristic of Peake, and it's created by a series of horizontal lines perpendicular to the folds of the curtain, and various other aspects of the painting, which seem to be very characteristic of a group of pictures that can be assembled around this one. In 1607, Peake was given the royal appointment of Sergeant Painter jointly with John de Critz. This was an important appointment, and it involved responsibility for all kinds of painting at court. Now, we have, fortunately, a document recording exactly what the Sergeant Painter was responsible for, which relates, in fact, to de Critz's appointment with his previous partner, Leonard Fryer, but there's it provides a very useful source of information about what sergeant painters did at this period, and this is Erna Auerbach's translation from Latin. The sergeant painter had to be the painter of all our works whatsoever, both in our palaces or royal houses, and in the great wardrobe, painting, gilding, or embellishing, also within our office of the revels and stables, concerning our ships and barges, and close barges, coaches, chariots, carriages, litters, wagons and close cars, tents and pavilions, heralds' coats, banners, trumpet banners, also painting in connection with the solemnization of funerals in any way, etc., etc. So you see that the sergeant painter's responsibilities were very many and very varied, and inevitably Peake must have had a very large body of people helping him with these. It was an administrative, managerial task, with a sort of oversight, artistic oversight, and I'm sure Peake himself was busy actually painting a lot of these things too, but with a great deal of help. I think we also have to assume that he had a very busy and active portrait workshop too, because there's a lot going on there as well. And I think that this is a theme that's come out of making art in Tudor Britain again and again, the collaborative nature of so much of the artistic activity that's going on at this time, and I'll come back to that. I think also that what comes out of Peake's sort of history that we must remember is that although I think those of us who think about Peake have a tendency to think of him as a Jacobean portrait painter, firstly, most of his output in all likelihood wasn't portraits, but this kind of decorative painting that he was doing for Elizabeth and subsequently for James. And secondly, most of his career took place during Elizabeth's reign. So he really is an Elizabethan portrait painter, or Elizabethan painter, rather than a Jacobean painter, insofar as his training and most of his career goes on. And I think that is evident when we look at the technical information as well, that he really is within that Elizabethan framework, although the most prominent of his portraits were produced in the early 17th century during the reign of James. He's to all intents and purposes an Elizabethan painter. Peake became particularly associated with Henry, Prince of Wales, for whom and of whom he painted a number of portraits, as well as decorating the interior of Henry's ship, the Prince Royal, jointly with another artist called Paul Isaacson. In most of the recent literature about Peake and about Henry, Peake is described as the prince's official portraitist, but I can't find that there is a surviving document making him this or recording him as this. And I wonder whether it actually would be better to think of him as de facto the painter of, although perhaps not always for, the royal children. In fact, there are a number of payments for portraits of Prince Charles, and there are a number of surviving portraits of Charles by Peake and also of Princess Elizabeth, but no portraits have been attributed to Peake of James I or Anne of Denmark, so there does seem to be an association with the royal children. Now, you can see in these portraits of Elizabeth that Peake's the compositions that he uses are very much still within the traditional 16th century kind of framework. Full length, full frontal, static images. He does something a little bit more adventurous in this the earliest of the three portraits, the one at the Maritime Museum, which has a landscape background, which was quite a new thing in English portraiture at this period, introduced probably by Marcus Gerrits. But as has been pointed out in the past, although she's in a landscape background, in effect it's sort of like a stage set behind her. She's not really integrated within it in the way you get in later people in later 17th century portraiture, for example, by Van Dyck. Or in the Metropolitan Museum picture, she's got a cloth of honour behind her, obviously very traditional, and the curtain, again, very metallic-looking cloth of gold curtain behind her in our portrait of her. Peake also, we believe, painted this portrait of Prince Henry in the National Portrait Gallery. And it, of course, also within a very conventional composition. And I've just shown, slightly randomly, these two portraits by Sanchez Cuello, just to show that the pose relates to royal portraits and important portraits that are being produced on the continent some time earlier. But they could, in fact, of course, be portraits by Antonis or by Titian, by any number of people who are painting royals and important sitters. Very often, also, they have tables covered with rich cloths and curtains in the background. In fact, this portrait of Henry is striking amongst Peake's portrait of Henry for being so conventional, because Peake really seems to have pulled out the stops for Henry, and this is very interesting. I think, in a way, I think it's often been commented on but not emphasised enough, that he really tried hard with Henry to do something new, and it was completely new in British portraiture to produce portraits like this, which have a sense of dynamism and movement. In British royal portraiture, I said British royal large-scale portraiture, there's nothing like this as a precedent for this in the portraiture of royals in oils in England or Scotland. And I think that's very significant. Now, we don't know, this portrait was probably painted for the Harrington family, and this painting was probably painted to be sent abroad in relation to marriage negotiations that were going on for Henry. So they're patronised by different people, Peake's portraits of Henry, but each time he seems to feel or his people who are paying him seem to feel that for this particular very significant patron, he needs to do something new and different. And of course, the most striking of these in this group is this well-known equestrian portrait of Purham Park, where the prince pulls along Father Time, whose hair, forelock, you see here, is tied onto the favour on Henry's arm. And I'm not going to dwell on these at great length because there isn't really time to, but I think it's important in extending the context for Peake's work to just consider quickly what he was doing in relation to Henry. It looks as though he used print sources for all of these very adventurous compositions. The closest one anyone's been able to find to this double portrait with Sir John Harrington, which also, I should say, exists in a version with Robert Devereux, the 3rd Earl of Essex, in the Royal Collection. It seems to be related, it's certainly in terms of theme, to an illustration in this book, The Noble Art of Venery or Hunting, which has been variously attributed to George Turberville or George Gascoigne, but it shows a moment in Hunting where the prince, as described in the text, in fact, in this illustration, it's Queen Elizabeth, and this executes a sort of ceremonial cut on the already dead deer. And this is what Prince Henry has just done here. He's sheathing his sword. You can actually see that there's a cut on the neck. Similarly, he looked to print source for his portrait of Henry to be sent to Italy. This extraordinary Goltzius print, which rather throws up contrast with Henry's very youthful appearance. But interestingly, the story of Manlius Torquatus does actually involve him killing a giant, which is going on over here. And so there is an implication about a sort of an individual being able to overcome great obstacles, or in this case, I think, a young man who's going to have a great military career, a great future. And it's recently been pointed out, and I think very convincingly, that a source for the equestrian portrait must be a Dürer's print, The Night, Death and the Devil. In fact, I think, the angle of the weapons, I mean, obviously you can't draw an exact parallel between the figures behind the horse, but I think the proximity of the rocky background and the wall as well, there's a sort of there seems to be a general influence there. I do find that convincing. Of course, it's also influenced by equestrian portraiture, continental equestrian portraiture, and I think particularly French royal portraiture, which was conventionally equestrian, but there is no convention of equestrian royal portraiture in England. So it's a remarkable thing. Okay, having given you that brief background to Peake, moving on to what we found out about our pictures at the NPG. These are two of the pictures I've shown you already that we've been looking at. Interestingly, they have provenances that suggest that Peake really was working for a close circle among people linked with Henry, particularly. The portrait of Henry has come from the Craven collection, and therefore seems very likely to have belonged to Elizabeth, most of whose paintings ended up in the Craven collection, and so that seems to be an important link there. Elizabeth's portrait has a more complicated provenance, but it seems it may have come from the collection of Sir Charles Cornwallis, who was Henry's treasurer. It actually came from Hengrave Hall, but there's a close family connection in the early 17th century between the Kitsons of Hengrave and the Cornwallises, and so that seems a possibility, and that's quite an interesting interconnection, partly because the third picture we looked at was this, and I'm deliberately showing this. It does have a head, but I'm deliberately showing it to you without the head. It's a portrait of Sir Charles Cornwallis. It's never before been suggested that this picture is by Peake, but when I was looking at it in another context, I thought, actually, technically it looks very like our other Peake portraits. And I thought it would be very interesting to see if these markers that we were looking for applied to this picture. You'll see why now. It's never been thought to be by Peake before, because it has this dreadfully weak, thinly painted, unskillfully painted head, which seems to require some kind of explanation. And again, I think this raises really interesting questions about workshop practice and the way that things were produced, and sort of hierarchies within painters' workshops in terms of who was doing what. But it is, I should emphasize, a very beautifully painted costume. And I'm just going to show you a detail of that, which seems to be absolutely typical of what we have found out about Peake's style, which is that it's very economically painted, very quickly painted, in a way, he has a system, seems to have a system for every type of texture that he's painting. And these systems seem to apply quite consistently across the different portraits. But more on that in a minute. In fact, just going back to the full picture, microscopic examination, I'm sorry I'm not able to show you all the details of this, but microscopic examination of this painting suggested that there were quite possibly not just two artists working on it, one who did the head, one who did the body, but multiple number of artists. One of the things that was thrown up was that the mixes for the white ruff and the cuffs and the doublet, which all appear to have the same sort of tonal values from a visual point of view, standing in front of the painting, they're all mixed with different combinations of pigments. And so that seems to beg some sort of justification. I mean, it could be that they were mixed by different studio assistants. It could be, it seems to me, that they were painted by different artists, that actually the cuff painter came in and did the cuffs, and the ruff painter did the ruff. But it's again, we don't have enough evidence yet to come to any proper conclusions about that. Another interesting thing that was thrown up was that the infrared reflectography found almost no underdrawing on any of our Peake portraits. But what it did find was completely different underdrawing under this hand and under this hand. Completely different. Very broad, brushy underdrawing under this hand, quite neat, sort of scratchy, dry underdrawing under this hand. Really looking like two different artists producing the hands. So that's very interesting as well, although possibly not conclusive. Moving on, it turns out that there are 3 portraits of Cornwallis that I've been able to find in our archive, all of which, as you see, use the same head. And although it's not terribly possible to see it on this slide, these 2 heads are significantly better than the head on our painting. But as you see, the costumes are completely different. So again, the suggestion would be, I think, that there was a face pattern used and that different costumes were painted in the studio. Interestingly, this one also has the Peake type of inscription on it there. My next job, I think, is to try and locate these pictures and have the tracing made of the heads to see if they really do fit. But it seems very, very likely that there were patterns used, and then a completely different level of expertise used in painting the head on top of the pattern. This shows what I think is of one of the most characteristic aspects of Peake's painting. Again, these metallic-looking highlights that give the fabric a feeling that it must have had some sort of metal thread in it. This is Cornwallis's sleeve, and this is the curtain in the background of Elizabeth of Bohemia. Under the microscope, really magnified under the microscope, you can see that they're put together in the same sort of way. There's a sort of thin, longer layer of parallel hatching to begin with, here and here, and then a thicker, shorter parallel hatches on top, and those seem to be very characteristic. Another characteristic of the Peake paintings that were looked at in the studio that really went across all 3, and that the conservators felt was very significant because they'd never seen it before in the Tudor paintings they've been looking at, were these very large, very beautiful chunks of very high quality smalt, which you can see, these bright blue pieces here. Both in Cornwallis and in Elizabeth on this, in these slides, and here in the purple on Henry. And actually there is, I think, some azurite in this too, but these big chunks of blue apparently are very, very high quality and non-discoloured smalt. Now this is thought to be, and I'm very, very significant and interesting, that he was using very expensive, high quality pigments which wouldn't necessarily have been seen. I mean, none of these are in blue areas, they're in purple or white areas, but what perhaps would have been known about, and that's another thing I think would be interesting to know, whether patrons or sitters knew about the expensive pigments that were in there, whether it gave them a sense of the quality and the expense of the object they were getting. Something that was very, very unusual that was found only in the portrait of Henry was a layer of metal leaf, quite possibly silver leaf, under the red lake glaze on the curtain. And I have said showing metal leaf here. In fact, I see this slide doesn't really, I think for most people you can't see that there's metal leaf, silver leaf under this red lake glaze. But Libby, I know, has with her a cross-section that shows the silver. So if anyone wanted to really see evidence of the silver, it's there. So the whole of the red curtain behind Henry has this layer of silver. Now this seems unusual in a whole number of ways. I mean, it's remarkable for anyone to be using metal leaf, especially a sophisticated painter working so closely for the court, to be using metal leaf in the early 17th century. It's very kind of archaic. It seems a very odd thing to do on a canvas painting, and the fact that it's on canvas, it has destroyed the effect of it as well, because it's been relined and therefore the canvas has been squashed and the red lake layer has been squashed. But I think we have to assume that before the canvas acquired its sort of craquelure, the silver leaf would have given the curtain a kind of reflective, glittering quality, in the same way it might have done on an earlier panel painting. But finally, the thing that's most strikingly unusual about it is that actually, in the course of the Making Art in Tudor Britain project, as I understand it, only one other portrait has been found with silver leaf under a red lake glaze like this, and that is this portrait of Edward VI. Now, our portrait of Edward VI is based, as you can see, on the portrait in the Royal Collection of Edward VI, which also has, under the coat in these two pictures, red lake glaze over a metal, possibly silver, leaf. And it seems to me that here the provenance of our picture becomes significant. If this picture did, as we think, belong to Elizabeth of Bohemia, if it was in the Royal Collection, as this picture was, it seems to me that it's very likely that there's a conscious reference in the Peake picture to the earlier portrait of Edward VI. Edward VI was Henry's predecessor as Prince of Wales. There isn't another Prince of Wales in England between Edward and Henry. The paintings with their windows, with the landscape scene, obviously seem to refer to one another, the curtain background, and finally this use of red lake with silver leaf, again, seems to me likely that there's a reference. And I think that that's really interesting. It would be a reference that perhaps would only be obvious to the painter and the patron, but not to people beyond that. Finally, just to sum up quickly, the three pictures that we have been looking at and are still looking at, what did we find out about them? What were these markers? Well, they seem to be the use of this very rich pigment, of the very high quality smalt, seem to be similar in all of them. All three seem to have similar, effectively double grounds, with a darker, browner pigmented lower layer and a sort of warm grey upper layer. And this seemed to also correspond with what was found in examination of other peaks elsewhere, the Elizabeth at the Metropolitan Museum and the equestrian portrait as well. So high quality smalt, yes. Very similar economical approaches to painting, for example, carpets. Very, very similar painting of carpets between the pictures. And again, there was a suggestion that there might be a specialist carpet painter who's doing that. And I think, as I say, without having got all the data together, this does raise some questions which I think we need to think about in relation not just to these pictures, but to perhaps all the pictures we're talking about and all the artists we're thinking about, which are about how workshops were organised. Whether there are parallels amongst other craftsmen in terms of people coming in and doing a bit on something and then that same bit on something else, whether there are sort of horizontal, as it were, activities going on. A carpet painter works on that painting and that painting and that painting. Whether there are people shared between workshops. I mean, de Critz and Peake were partners as sergeant painters. Were they sharing workshop people? We are going to look at some de Critz paintings later on, and I think that's also going to raise that subject. But I also think we need to think about the concept of authorship in this context and what authorship actually means. When is a painting by an artist and when is it by his studio? What does it mean? What studio involvement mean? Is it even a useful question to say this is by the artist, this is by his studio? I mean, I think the people, Anita later, who's talking about Miervelt, has some similar questions about Miervelt. With a big studio like this, what does the artist's involvement actually mean? Is it simply organisational? Do we associate quality with the named artist who's the head of the studio, or do we appreciate that it comes right across in terms of different areas and different people being involved? And I think I just really want to leave those questions with you and hope that perhaps in discussion we can take them up a bit further. Thank you.